There's something particularly interesting about Rome and Germany's relationship, how they could have potentially become one entity, though not during ancient Rome's peak. By the end of the Roman Empire, there were actually many Germans in Rome. This makes me wonder, what if Rome hadn't stopped at the Rhine River? What if they had pushed further and conquered Germania, the region Romans called Germania? It might sound as improbable as Germany winning World War I or II. Both the conquest of Germania and Rome's preservation rank pretty high on the list of unlikely alternate history scenarios. I've spent considerable time thinking about this to create what I hope will be a realistic and original take on this fascinating what-if scenario. The first invasion. Let's go back to 27 BC. Augustus had just established the foundations of the empire, and the Pax Romana was rising from the ashes of the old republic. He was feeling confident. While the Principate focused on consolidation and reform, several regions at the empire's edges caught his attention. Among these was the sparsely populated, forested region east of the Rhine River. Exactly 50 years after Julius Caesar briefly ventured into Germania and retreated, Germanic tribes attacked the governor of Gaul, crossing the river and defeating a legion, even capturing a Roman military standard. Augustus responded by sending his stepson Drusus to recover the eagle. However, Drusus got sidetracked and ended up focusing on conquering and subduing as many tribes as possible, conducting back-to-back campaigns between 12 and 9 BC. Tragically, after all his successes, he fell from his horse and died from gangrene, an inglorious end for such an accomplished commander. During his campaigns, Drusus and his 7 legions constructed 50 bases along the Rhine River. They dug canals allowing their fleet to sail along the North Sea and surprise their enemies. The Germanic tribes were simply outmatched by the most sophisticated, well-supplied, well-armed, and well-trained army of their time. Many tribal chiefs surrendered, paying tribute to Rome and sending their youngest sons to be raised in the imperial capital. One of these young hostages was a 10-year-old boy named Arminius, who, along with his brother, learned Latin and Roman customs. No one knew then that this young boy would later become Rome's biggest problem. He would eventually destroy 3 entire Roman legions. The Teutoburg Forest disaster. When considering an alternate history where Rome conquered Germania, 2 key questions arise. First, could Rome ever actually conquer Germania? The answer is yes, because in our actual history, they did occupy about half of it, depending on how you define Germania's borders. Around 6 BC, Rome's borders extended beyond the Rhine River and controlled territory within Germania. While they didn't build complex cities like those in Gaul, the local tribes paid tribute and submitted to Roman authority. Roman soldiers patrolled these lands. The second question is, why would Rome want to conquer Germania? To many Romans, it seemed like just an endless dark forest. What was the incentive? We'll explore that question later, but for now, it's important to understand that the Rhine border wasn't always destined to be the limit of Roman expansion. It became set in stone due to the actions of both individuals and larger groups. Not to be outdone by his brother, Emperor Tiberius proved himself a worthy successor to Augustus by organizing a massive invasion of the Marcomanni tribe. The Roman war machine seemed unstoppable, and under Tiberius's leadership, it took 6 years to completely defeat the Germanic Celts in the west. Things were looking promising for Rome, but like many conflicts involving Germany, events in the Balkans forced them to change their plans. The Romans had focused so much attention on their Germanic frontier that several Illyrian chiefs in what was then called Pannonia decided to rebel. This wasn't just a small uprising. We're talking about an army of 200,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Tiberius had to postpone his Germanic campaign to deal with this threat. Interestingly, his army included none other than Arminius, now a well-trained young man. In the forested hills of the Balkans, Arminius gained experience and earned the trust of his Roman superiors, learning their tactics from the inside. During Tiberius's absence, Publius Quinctilius Varus was appointed as the first official governor of the Germania province. Varus was known for his harsh taxation policies and even harsher punishments. He had previously crucified 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. While Rome wasn't built in a day and required the effort of millions led by many exceptional leaders, Varus stands out as one of the most incompetent commanders, perhaps of all time. A fatal mistake. Despite receiving multiple clear warnings, Varus led 3 entire legions deep into the Germanic forests. He trusted the locals when they offered to house some of his men, and he trusted Arminius, who reported a German rebellion that required them to venture even deeper into the woods. This wasn't Varus's smartest decision. When the Romans finally realized what was happening, it was too late. 3 legions found themselves surrounded by German warriors in the middle of the forest. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest would read like a comedy if it wasn't so horrific. Arminius had never forgotten what the Romans had done to his people. He had been secretly uniting the tribes under Rome's nose, and now he would make them pay. 20,000 Romans died, 3 whole legions completely destroyed. Rome was no stranger to devastating losses, ambushes, or rebellious chiefs. 20,000 casualties was relatively small compared to losses they'd suffered against enemies like Spartacus, Hannibal, or the Parthians. But this defeat was different for 2 reasons. First, it was the first major defeat of the empire, the first stain on Augustus's otherwise perfect record. From the emperor's perspective, he needed to send a strong message before other chiefs, or worse, Roman generals, got any ideas. Second, this humiliating defeat came through treachery. To Romans, ambush and treachery weren't considered proper warfare. They viewed it as cowardice. For centuries, Rome's approach to warfare involved meeting on an open battlefield under the gods' watchful eyes and seeing who would win. It's why they particularly disliked the Parthians with their mounted archers. Arminius had taken a dangerous gamble that paid off, but in doing so, he destroyed any hope that Germanic tribes could be peacefully integrated into the imperial system. The Roman response. If Germania wouldn't join the empire willingly, it would have to be pacified. Rome's version of pacification, that is. What followed was a series of campaigns under a commander called Germanicus. Rome's revenge was brutal. Marching east of the Rhine again, they systematically destroyed any tribe that had participated in the plot. The conflict continued for years, ending only when the Romans finally got the fair fight they wanted. Despite heavy losses on both sides, Rome emerged victorious. Arminius was defeated and faded from relevance, eventually being poisoned by a political rival. Rome never did conquer Germania, and this became a source of pride for later German dynasties. Both Alesia and Teutoburg were romanticized by medieval dynasties, and the Prussians as examples of resistance against Roman rule. In the 19th century, the German Empire even built a statue of Arminius in the very forest where 20,000 Romans had died, facing toward their modern-day Latins, the French. What if Arminius had died? So here's an interesting thought. What if Arminius had died before he became a problem for Rome? Rome had suffered many casualties putting down the Great Illyrian Revolt. So it's not unreasonable to imagine Arminius might have fallen in battle, maybe from a random arrow, a sword cut, or some other military misfortune. But would the death of one man really change history so dramatically that it would lead to the conquest of Germania? Well, before the Illyrian Revolt, Emperor Augustus himself had planned a campaign with his stepson to push the Roman frontier to the Elbe River. For this goal, his successor Tiberius was promised 12 legions and a massive fleet. Before Teutoburg, he was supposed to carry out these plans. Instead, in our timeline, he appointed the brilliant but brutal Germanicus to use those plans for a war of extermination rather than conquest. Despite Varus's incompetence, he probably could have held the province until Tiberius finished in Pannonia. In this alternate timeline, by 11 AD, an unprepared and divided Germanic people, partially bought off with Roman gold, would face an army of 66,000 men led by the future Emperor Tiberius, who had mastered military, administrative, and diplomatic skills. Unlike Germanicus, Tiberius knew when to put away the sword and use Roman gold instead. Diplomacy and money were sometimes more effective than warfare. Integrating Germania Drusus had already dealt the first major blow to the Germanic clans. And if Rome's history before and after this conflict teaches us anything, everything west of the Elbe River could potentially have been conquered within 2 to 5 years. As incredible as that might sound, the conquests of Greece, Gaul, Egypt, and Britannia were all accomplished in similar timeframes. Germania's distance didn't make it impossible to conquer. Terms would be set, tributes and hostages taken, and a fierce but fragmented Germanic people could be subdued by an enemy they saw as invincible. Remember, without the Teutoburg disaster, nothing would challenge that perception. Sometimes, simply playing on the fears of the conquered and manipulating their local politics was enough to win. Rome had used this tactic many times before. Germania's value. But what made Germania valuable to Rome? There were several key resources. First, there was the Amber Road. Amber was a luxury resource that the Mediterranean world was obsessed with. Unlike gold and gemstones, amber was primarily found in just a few places on Earth: the Dominican Republic, Myanmar, and the Baltic region. The Amber Road from the Baltic dated back to Neolithic times, and the material, which Romans called electrum, was incredibly precious to them. This same resource later made the Teutonic Order and Hanseatic League wealthy. Control over the Elbe River would guarantee tremendous revenue for the empire, justifying even more resources being sent to consolidate the territory. Then there was Saxony. During the Middle Ages, the Saxons became famous for more than just plundering. They were Europe's best smiths, developing pattern welding techniques similar to Damascus steel. This was largely thanks to the terrain of Saxony and Bohemia itself. These hills were rich in metals: iron, copper, silver, lead, and zinc, as well as the clay needed for bloomery furnaces. In our timeline, Rome never discovered these resources, but with more time in the region, once they uncovered what lay in these hills, they would never want to leave. This alternate history would see different patterns of urban development, areas that eventually became Prague and Dresden, which in our timeline had to wait until the 9th and 12th centuries to become settlements, would have been founded by Rome at its peak. The entire region would receive the same treatment Romans gave to Cologne, Mainz, Trier, and Xanten, all of which started as forts. Finally, there were the trees. This might seem trivial, but consider this. When I visited Greece a few years ago, I was surprised by how barren the hills were. The Athenians had cut down so many trees to build their fleet that they caused severe deforestation, an environmental disaster from which central Greece never really recovered. This same effect eventually impacted the Roman Empire as a whole. But Germania still had trees, lots of them. This new lumber supply would enable immense charcoal production, helping with agricultural development and construction of walls and buildings. The fall of Rome. To understand how conquering Germania might have changed Rome's fate, we need to understand when and why Rome fell in the first place. Many people think these are two very different questions, but the rise and fall of civilizations never happen overnight. Whether it's the bureaucratic Han dynasty, the maritime Venetian Republic, nomadic Mongols, or Ottoman Empire, all had steady rises and falls. We just tend to focus on the milestone moments. The Roman Empire was no different, and pointing to years like 410 or 476 AD doesn't really explain why it fell. Was it overexpansion, corruption, invasion, civil war, slavery, Christianity? Well, yes to all of these, but there was one overlooked factor that was bigger than all of them: plagues. The Antonine Plague, which lasted from 165 to 180 AD, ended Rome's golden age and began the process that unraveled the Western Empire. Sure, there were moments when Rome bounced back, but consider the parallel to Alexios Komnenos, who saved the Byzantines from certain demise by calling the Crusades and relying on Italian republics for trade and navy. For at least a century, the Byzantines did well, and then they imploded with the Fourth Crusade. The Antonine Plague killed Emperor Lucius Verus and significantly affected the reign of the incredible Marcus Aurelius. Most importantly, it wiped out between a quarter and a third of the entire population. Just imagine what that meant. Trade networks broke down. The economy collapsed. Germanic tribes invaded in droves. The empire experienced vast labor shortages, and people began abandoning urban centers for the countryside. Everything that made Rome Rome was falling apart, especially Roman medicine. How different things could have been. Roman medicine was the unsung hero of the empire, contributing to their superior logistics and a life expectancy not seen again until the 20th century. Their amputation survival rates were better than those of the American Civil War. While Rome was crippled by the plague, its medical knowledge died too. Archaeological findings and manuscripts show a severe decline in their knowledge and application of remedies and treatments. Roman doctors understood all sorts of diseases and recognized the importance of preventive medicine and nutrition. They had sanitation, anesthesia, and antiseptics. The only thing they, and every other pre-19th century civilization, lacked was germ theory. While they had some defenses against bacteria, Rome was powerless against smallpox. When the plague first hit, the doctors were the first to confront it, and within 2 decades, every teacher and student was gone. Without its healing capabilities and with 1/3 of its population dead, Rome began relying on Germanic mercenaries for defense. The old system of large legions and walls defending the empire was replaced with a more flexible, autonomous system, a system that would eventually evolve into feudalism. The Black Death fundamentally changed European society, but the Antonine Plague's effects were possibly even more far-reaching. The empire wasn't really overextended until the plague. The rich elite who had previously participated in the war effort now used Germanic people for that role. The plague transformed them into a class with nothing better to do than engage in corruption and power plays, often leading to civil wars. Rome had dealt with invasions before, but after the plague, they opened their gates to the one group of people who hated them most, then handed them both keys and swords. Just 2 years after the outbreak, Germanic people crossed the Rhine for the first time in 200 years. The number of slaves actually decreased after the plague since Rome was now on the defensive, which, combined with the labor shortages, crippled the economy. How Germany could have saved Rome. But in our alternate timeline, where Germania was conquered early, things could have been very different. The plague would still have hit and wiped out 1/3 of the population. Marcus Aurelius would still have been succeeded by Commodus, who was nothing like his father. However, while the Romans in our timeline opened their gates to Germanic chiefs for protection, in this timeline there would be no Germanic chiefs, at least none outside modern-day Poland or Scandinavia. By 165 AD in this alternate timeline, Germanic people would be speaking Latin, enjoying gladiatorial games, and forming a cornerstone of the empire, much like in Gaul. The politics of centuries ago would be long forgotten. Things would still be bad after the plague, of course. But recruiting German mercenaries wouldn't be an option. They hadn't existed as a separate people since the time of the first emperors. Even if Rome decided to hire foreign mercenaries, who would they invite? Picts, Armenians, Parthians? Apart from the Parthians, every major culture surrounding the empire in this timeline would either be absorbed or eliminated. The Elbe River, followed by the Danube, would make for an excellent defensive line. The migrations would still have happened because the Huns would still have appeared. Like plagues, nomadic invasions were somewhat inevitable, and many people would still have pressed against Roman defenses. But now, there would be no hostile Germans to let them in. The migrations would simply be absorbed at the border, a border that would be much easier to defend, protecting an empire that wasn't as weak or corrupted. This wouldn't be peak Rome. That era would still die with the plague. But perhaps there would be no crisis of the 3rd century, which could have been massive. Where the timeline goes from here is anyone's guess. How different Europe might look. When dealing with alternate history, we must be careful not to project too far into the future. However, we can reasonably speculate about some immediate effects of a Romanized Germania. The spread of Christianity would likely have been dramatically different. In our timeline, Germanic peoples adopted Arian Christianity before eventually converting to Catholicism. With Germania fully integrated into the empire by the time Christianity spread, the religious landscape of Europe might have been more uniformly Catholic from the start. Without the centuries of religious conflict between Arian and Nicene Christians, the Germanic languages as we know them might never have developed. Just as Gaul became thoroughly Latinized, Germania would likely have developed its own vulgar Latin dialects. These would eventually evolve into distinct Romance languages, but they would be fundamentally different from modern German. The linguistic border between Romance and Germanic languages would likely have been pushed far to the east, possibly to the Vistula River. Urban development would have followed Roman patterns rather than medieval ones. Instead of the organic growth of medieval German cities, We might have seen a network of planned Roman cities connected by their famous roads. The Rhine-Elbe corridor would have become one of the empire's most important economic regions, possibly rivaling Italy itself in importance. Without the Germanic migrations that helped bring down the Western Roman Empire, the entire concept of the Middle Ages as we know them might never have existed. There would have been no Frankish kingdom, no Holy Roman Empire, and no feudalism as we know it. The Slavic migrations would still have occurred, but they would have met a very different Europe. Instead of encountering various Germanic kingdoms, they would have faced a more unified Roman response. The Slavic peoples might have been gradually absorbed into the empire's eastern frontiers, much as the Germans would have been centuries earlier. Trade routes would have remained more stable and sophisticated. The Roman road network, extended through Germania, would have maintained connections between the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea. The decline in urban life and literacy that characterized the early Middle Ages might have been significantly lessened or avoided entirely. This alternate history reveals something profound about the actual course of history. How much of what we consider inevitable was actually contingent on specific events and individual decisions. The division between Latin and Germanic Europe, which seemed so natural for centuries, might have been nothing more than the result of a few key moments. A young hostage's decision to betray his adoptive empire, an administrator's poor judgment, an emperor's choice to prioritize consolidation over expansion. The fall of Rome wasn't inevitable, nor was the rise of Germanic Europe. The world we know, with its particular blend of Roman and Germanic influences, was shaped by countless decisions and accidents. Perhaps somewhere in the multiverse, there exists a timeline where Rome did conquer Germania, where the borders of Latin civilization extend to the Elbe, where different languages echo through the streets of Dresden and Prague, and where the Great Migration period reshaped a very different Europe. But our history unfolded as it did, and from these events emerged the unique cultural synthesis that would eventually build modern Europe. Whether this alternative would have been better or worse is impossible to say. What we can say is that understanding how things might have been different helps us better appreciate the complexity and contingency of the history we actually inherited. The story of Rome and Germania reminds us that history is not predetermined. The Rhine frontier, which became such a crucial dividing line in European history, was not destined to be the boundary between Roman and Germanic worlds. It became that boundary through a complex interplay of individual choices, structural forces, and simple chance. In studying this alternate history, we gain a deeper appreciation for both what actually happened and what might have been. We see how the actions of individuals like Arminius shaped the course of empires, and how seemingly minor events can have consequences that echo through centuries. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can draw from this exercise is the importance of perspective in understanding history. The world we know, with its nations, languages, and cultural divisions, is just one of many possible outcomes. By imagining how things might have been different, we can better understand why they turned out the way they did.